I'm going to talk about engineering globalization. I think this is an area that is globalization in the engineering enterprise is happening. It's happening quite rapidly, but we really have fragmented knowledge about what's going on. There's various people studying this. In fact, I hosted a workshop that was funded by NSF a couple of weeks ago where we brought some engineering educators, we brought some management academics, as well as some policy folks together to start talking about these types of issues to see where we could learn from each other in terms of cross-pollination. I won't talk too much about that, but I'll talk about some data issues and I think some implications for the U.S. engineering workforce. I think that the U.S. engineering enterprise is being transformed quite significantly, and I don't think there's enough attention being paid to it. And I think there's two major factors here. One is globalization, which is opening lots of opportunities to sell to new markets. We hear famously from employers like Jeff Immelt at General Electric that, hey, 95% of the world's consumers are outside of the U.S. There are all these great opportunities to sell into these emerging markets, some of which we're growing very rapidly, although it's starting to slow down, India and China in particular. We're also seeing firms tap lower cost overseas engineering talent and developing that talent. And there's a response from universities in countries like China and India to produce more engineers specifically for foreign multinational corporations and also to sell through outsourcing and whatnot. There's another phenomena that's going on, and I don't think enough attention is being paid to this, and that is that universities are going global much more significantly. And this is in a number of different ways. One way is by setting up actually branch campuses abroad. Another is so for example, RIT has a microelectronics program in Dubai, but lots of other prominent universities are going global that way. But also we're starting to see foreign graduate students, we're starting to see foreign students come in to top universities in engineering at the undergraduate level. Which is a relatively new phenomena. I don't think anybody has any data on that, but just anecdotally talking to folks, we're starting to see that at some of the top universities. And that's a different flow, and that's a different phenomena. In addition to globalization, there's been shifts, really significant shifts in corporate norms. As we've, over the last 20 years, firms have focused much more on shareholder value, which has shifted then the focus of what they invest in and how they invest, and think about employment relationships. And so firms, multinational firms, aren't going to treat their U.S. workers any better or any worse than their Indian employees or the German employees. And then I think that has really fundamental impacts on the engineering enterprise and how we think about it. And I also think that we need much more in the area of research efforts to understand these transformations. If you believe, like I do, that innovation is at the heart of economic growth and job creation, and I would take it one step further, that engineering is at the heart of a lot of innovation, then we should really care about these transformations. Unfortunately, there's really very little being spent on this, so there's very little funding for this kind of research and analysis. I also think that we need to maintain a virtuous cycle to spur long-term economic development. What I'm observing, and again, this is a little bit anecdotal, but it's based also on some data, corporations now are thinking about their engineering talent very differently. There are much more short-term, sort of just-in-time employment, and we're seeing that they're not investing in U.S. engineering talent. And then more broadly, that we need a new sort of competitiveness discussion. We heard the Rising Above the Gathering Storm and the Competes Act. I think we need to be thinking about competitiveness, the 21st century competitiveness, very differently than we thought about the 1980s manufacturing competitiveness debate. In the 1980s, it was about General Motors competing with Toyota and thinking about it in terms of those corporations competing against one another. Today, it's really IBM competing its American workforce against its Indian workforce. And what we're seeing in terms of the data is that, in fact, the Indian workforce is winning. And that's very clear from where IBM is shifting its talent. And we also need to be focusing on how American workers can justify their 5x salary premium. So we're paid a lot more than our counterparts, than my cousins in India. How do we justify that salary premium? And I think that's a difficult challenge, and I don't think we focused enough attention about how to make workers in the workforce. It's really about workers competing across borders. How do we make them basically justify that premium? So let me talk very briefly about the state of the U.S. labor market. I think that we're in a very odd and bad situation in terms of job creation. If you look, this data basically just shows the job creation by decades from 1941 to 51, 51 to 61, and this is the millions of jobs that net additional jobs there were in, for example, 1951 versus 41. There was 10.9 million more jobs, and you see every decade we've created lots and lots of jobs, except for this past decade, 2001 to 2011. We're in a very different situation than we were in the past. And this is the same chart, but just showing it in terms of percentage increases, so normalizing for the employment levels, the absolute employment levels. And what we've seen is over the last decade that private sector job creation has basically stalled. And what I've done here is shown the red line is the actual non-farm employment levels based on the establishment survey. So that's basically the total number of jobs. You can see we had about 72 million back in 1980. And we average about 2 million additional jobs in the private sector over that two-decade time frame from 1980 to 2000. And then from 2000 to 2011, we actually we've lost 1 million jobs, even though we have 32 million more Americans. So I think we've had this really lost decade of jobs overall. And this very deep hole, if you look there, the green line versus the red line there, you know, by my estimates, we're short about 21 million jobs. So it's much deeper than the Great Recession, which destroyed about 8 million jobs or so. And this matters a lot because as we think about flexible labor markets, part of the argument about flexibility is that people will be easily reabsorbed into the job market if they're laid off. And the reality is when you don't have job creation, that becomes much more difficult. So if we turn now looking at the engineering employment over the last decade, we have a lot of folks who talk in the public discussion about how we have a shortage of engineers, and this is a great area. If we actually look at the employment data over that decade, or 11 years, in thousands, we have about between 1.8 and 1.9 million engineers in the U.S. And if you look over that 11-year period, we had 30,000 increase. This is the CPS, the household survey data. And it's not as though we didn't graduate engineers, right? We graduate about 60,000 bachelor's degrees, about 30,000 roughly master's degrees. So we graduated about 900,000 or so engineers over this time frame where we basically had flat employment levels. And part of, in thinking about this talk, a lot of the earlier speakers talked about the need for more data, and I certainly support the need for more data. But I think we also need is to think about the ways in which data are analyzed. So we need to think about our analytic frameworks, and we also need to talk about the public discussion and how this data is sort of framed. So this is just an example, and I'll give you two sort of examples in terms of the public discussion now. This is an example of how someone is interpreting unemployment rates and unemployment data. And this is a direct quote from Brad Smith, who was chief counsel of Microsoft at a U.S. Senate hearing this summer. And basically what he was arguing is that full employment is 5%, and since STEM workers are at 5% unemployment rates, they're at full employment. And basically the solution that we should have is what you see at the bottom there is we will not bring unemployment down to the extent desired until we skill up the population to attract the jobs that otherwise will be located elsewhere. So the basic argument is that if everybody in the U.S. had a college degree, we would be at 4% unemployment. The reality, of course, though, is that full employment for college graduates is generally about 2% or so. And what I'm showing, I won't show you all the data here, I'll just point to the bottom line here. If you look at the average unemployment rates for computer and math occupations and electrical engineers, they were actually higher than for overall BS bachelor's degree graduates. And so STEM, in the sense of at least these indicators, right, of this data, wasn't a more attractive field per se, right? The unemployment rates were actually higher. Again, in contrast to a lot of the public discussion that we hear out there. And I'll skip over that. Let me talk a little bit about offshoring now. So why do companies utilize overseas talent? The bottom line is pretty clear. You can pay an entry-level Indian IT worker about $7,000 a year. You could hire a chartered accountant, which is equivalent to a CPA in India, for about $5,000 a year. So it's no surprise that companies see that and see the attractiveness of that. There's also lots of other reasons. Developing countries have strategies with tax holidays and whatnot. But I think there's this important, real significant shift over the last 20 years, and that is that the fate of U.S. workers no longer figures in corporate decision-making. And the example I like to use is IBM. They never laid off an employee until 1992, and then they started laying, Lou Gerstner came in, they started laying workers off. Some people say that that actually saved IBM. But fast forward 10 years to 2002, and the Wall Street Journal reported that, in fact, IBM had a strategy where they were, a human resource strategy where they were forcing their U.S. workers to train foreign replacements as a condition of severance and unemployment insurance. That's a pretty radical change in the way that firms behave. And I don't think that that's been captured enough in our thinking about these kinds of issues and thinking about competitiveness. Overseas workers can afford to be paid less. How can you live in India on a $7,000 a year salary? Well, but the cost of living is significantly less. And this is a very rough estimate based on some World Bank data, purchasing power parity. You can live equally well off in India on a $13,000 a year salary as you can in the U.S. on a $70,000 a year salary. So what's the implication of this is that, as I mentioned earlier, is that U.S. workers have to justify our 5x plus salary levels. The obvious answer is for us to be 5 times more productive. It's not so obvious how we actually achieve that, particularly as you've got firms like IBM and others who are going to take the latest tools and technologies. I mean, one of the reasons we're more productive is we have better tools and access to better tools and technologies. But now that those companies would be crazy not to take those latest tools and technologies to those $7,000 and $10,000 a year salaried workers in India and elsewhere. I also think that low salaries in these low-cost countries is likely to persist for many years. And every developing country sees this as a strategy for economic development. So you have countries like Egypt who say, hey, India was able to get into this game of low-cost knowledge work. We're going to get in there, and so I think you're going to see this supply response, and I think you're seeing it already. So how much work has moved offshore and what work's actually moved offshore? No one knows, and no one is measuring it, right? No one is actually trying to figure out how much work is moving, what type of work is moving, why it's moving. Is it incentives from policy? Is it the supply of STEM graduates? And so we really don't have much insight into what's going on. And I'll bring this to something that, I attended a White House event that President Obama had on insourcing in January. I was invited to attend that. And the question I asked was, their argument was that there was a lot of backshoring happening, right? And they based it on this Boston Consulting Group report, which was really a rehash of some stories in Business Week done by Pete and Gardio on NCR and Dayton and so on and so forth. So I asked the question is, well, who's measuring it? How do we know how much backshoring is really happening versus how much offshoring is going on? And no one really had an answer, and no one was really motivated to try to measure these kinds of things. So what do we know about the workforce impacts from offshoring? And how am I doing on? Okay. The argument from the economists is that the aggregate labor market clears, that the total number of U.S. jobs is a function of population and labor force participation, and unemployment really is a cyclic phenomena set by fiscal and monetary policies and the business cycle, and that trade has little impact on aggregate job market. What they would say is that there is job dislocation at the micro level, that people do lose jobs. They would also say that tradable jobs experience wage losses. So we see this, for example, EDS, electronic data systems, when they were absorbed by Hewlett-Packard, took 30 to 50% pay cuts to stay on the job, in part because they knew they were being competed against folks in India and whatnot. The economists would also say that there's going to be a change in the mix of U.S. occupations, and that in many cases U.S. workers will move to non-tradable occupations, or hopefully the better solution would be that they would become more competitive and more productive to justify those salaries and stay in those tradable occupations. So in sum, complementary workers gain, substitutable workers lose. And we really have two competing theories on the workforce. One is that there's going to be a division of labor by skill level. This is what I like to call the Apple iPad theory. If you look at the back of an Apple iPad, it says what, designed in Cupertino, California, made in China. And so the argument is that all we have to do is move up skill to high skill work, and then innovation is sort of our savior. And I think this is the dominant narrative here in Washington, and sort of the Washington consensus of what we're betting on for the future. The U.S. keeps high-skill, high-wage jobs and offshores the low-skill, labor-intensive jobs. And that offshoring is a win-win because we reabsorb those people who are losing into the market. And so the simple answer is sort of move up skill and move to better industries, right? So the greenfield, sort of clean energy areas and whatnot. The other theory, which is promoted by Alan Blinder in particular, most prominently, is a division of labor based on tradability. And basically what he argues is that work that's done remotely is vulnerable, but face-to-face work is going to be sticky. So if you think about work that can be done remotely, like computer programming or even accounting, that's vulnerable to lower cost competition. But face-to-face work will be sticky. So if you're a surgeon, you're likely, aside from the telesurgery that goes on, you're likely to keep your job, and if you're a barber, you're likely to keep your job because that's hard to offshore. And what he did was he did a very sort of quick look at the 800 SOCs, all the BLS occupations, and he said about 30 million or so of all U.S. jobs are vulnerable to offshoring. What he's saying there is not that these jobs will be offshored, but that they're newly tradable, and that you'll get a lot of wage competition in those areas. He also did a very interesting thing where he did a correlation between which jobs are vulnerable and education level, sort of testing this theory out that if we just have more education, that sort of makes us immune, and he found that there was no correlation with education. And his argument is that and by the way, most high-tech occupations are vulnerable, according to his sort of speculative study. And his argument is, look, we should specialize in sticky jobs and industries, jobs and industries that are going to be non-tradable, and that we should invest our scarce resources in education investments in those types of jobs that are going to be sticky and non-tradable. What's new in this round of globalization is that, in fact, R&D and innovation is being offshored. And again, we don't have great data on this, but we have enough anecdotes to know that some of this is going on, and some of it sort of seriously is going on. And I think it confounds sort of that Apple iPad narrative, the dominant narrative that we have. And we know that low-cost countries are attracting R&D and innovation investments. And it's not so much that what matters is that they're getting the R&D, it's that they have the capacity to do R&D, which means that they probably can capture a lot of the downstream type of work that comes from the R&D, right? We don't invest in R&D for the sake of creating research jobs, right? We only have about 1 million R&D jobs in the U.S. We invest in R&D because we hope that we can capture a good amount of the design, development, and production jobs that get created afterwards. I think that those jobs are going to be much more leaky, and that type of work will be much more leaky because the capacity offshore has gotten so much better. Again, Why aren't we measuring these kinds of things? Why aren't we thinking about these kinds of things? I think a lot of that has to do with sort of the political economy of these discussions. So let me talk about one case study, and that's the case of IT services. It's an area that I think is a sort of a harbinger for a lot of other areas. It's an area that was one of the first movers in terms of offshoring, and I think we do have enough sort of financial data and company data to draw some conclusions. We have an emergence of a global IT services business model. In fact, it's not an emergence, it's actually a global IT services business model. It emerged from about 1998 to 2005, and then now it's basically the dominant business model within IT services. We know that offshore outsourcing firms are the market leaders within these sectors. And what you've got are basically the market leaders were the Indian-based IT companies who are trying to capture U.S. customers. About 65% of the Indian IT services market is for sale in the U.S., for export to the U.S. And we also know that these companies don't hire American workers, that they rely on non-immigrant work visas, particularly the H-1B and the L-1 guest worker visas. And what happened was a very interesting experience, which was here was a natural experiment. You wanted to see how U.S. companies would respond to this competitive challenge. If you talked to IBM or EDS back in 2003 and you said Tata, Consultancy, Infosys, these are your competitors, they would laugh you out of the room. By 2005, they had a whole different view, right? Because those firms really became direct competitors. Now the question was, how will IBM respond to this competition? Would it respond by investing in its U.S. workforce, by making them more productive and capable, investing in tools and technologies, or would it respond by jettisoning its U.S. workforce in favor of adopting basically the offshore outsourcing business model? In fact, what they did was the latter, and I'll show you some data that shows this. And this was very rapid. Between 2004 and 2007, the whole sector was turned upside down, completely transformed. You can see this in employment data and so on and so forth. So let me show you. Here was a sort of a snapshot in time in 2005 showing some financial data, and what I'm showing here is the market capitalization, and that's in millions, so that's about 20 billion for Infosys, sales, and then profit margin. These are publicly traded firms, so you could get the data, and then I have EDS, which is now part of HP, but that was the largest of the US-based firms. And what you see in 2005 is that Infosys, if Marty and I want to take Infosys private off the public exchanges, we'd have to raise $20 billion to buy out the shareholders, right? That was the value of Infosys at that time. EDS, which was the largest of the US-based firms, was $12.5 billion in terms of market capitalization. And it wasn't because of sales. Infosys didn't have large sales at $1.6 billion in sales versus EDS, which had 20 times the sales, right? 26 billion or so. Now, what's the reason for this? Well, the reason that the stock market was valuing and research analysts were valuing Infosys so much more was that their net profit margin, not their gross margins, their net profit margin was on average 28%, and they've actually maintained that to now about 25% or so, in a sector where you were doing really well if you were getting 6 or 8% net margins. This was a disruptive innovation, a disruptive business model. And so what happened when Michael Jordan, who was CEO at EDS at the time, not that Michael Jordan, a different Michael Jordan, went to Wall Street, what did Wall Street say? He said, how come Infosys can get 28% profit margins and you can only get 2% or 3%? Well, you need to start adopting that business model. And sure enough, that's exactly what all of these firms started to do. IBM in 2006 held a historic analyst conference. So they took their whole executive team, their CEO, CTO, CFO. You can actually listen to the podcast and look at the 200-odd PowerPoint slides that they did. This was in Bangalore that they held this historic meeting. And basically what they were doing is they were trying to sell the Wall Street analysts on their India strategy, their offshoring strategy. And what this shows here is what IBM was predicting was going to happen. So in the left-hand pane, you see it's 2005. And the width of each of these bars, you see India there at the left leftmost bar there. The width of the bar is basically the depth of the talent pool. And then the height of the bar is the wage rate, so what it actually costs. So India was about $4 an hour and had a good number of developers. The U.S., of course, was thicker, but about $27 an hour. And what IBM was expecting is by 2010 that, in fact, India would basically triple the amount of its talent pool, and wage rates would go up to about $7 an hour. The U.S. would maintain around $26 an hour. So one of the arguments we've heard from folks who say offshoring is no big deal and won't be any big deal is that, in fact, that the talent pool is very limited in these low-cost countries, when, in fact, if you look at companies like IBM, that's not what they were thinking, and that's not what they think in terms of the response. So from a U.S. worker point of view is, how do you respond to these kinds of trends? Well, we know how IBM responded. In 2003, what this shows is the blue bar is the U.S. headcount for IBM versus its Indian headcount in the green bar. So you can see back in 2003, IBM had about 135,000 or so U.S. Workers and only about 6,000 workers in India in 2003. By 2009, they were almost even Steven as the U.S. headcount started to decline quite significantly, where the Indian headcount went up to almost 100,000. Now, IBM stopped disclosing its headcounts in the U.S. and elsewhere in 2010, but we know from talking to experts who are out there, as well as some of the union folks at Alliance at IBM, that in fact the Indian headcount is probably about 140,000. The U.S. headcount is about 90,000 right now. So you're seeing very clear substitution of workers happening in terms of IBM. Now, IBM stock has done quite well over this period of time, right? It's gone from about $100 a share to almost $200, about $188, I think it was yesterday. Now, one of the key policies that we've had in place and there's been a lot of public discussion about this, is H-1B visas. And I won't get into the nitty-gritty of it, but just to say that we have data, we have information about how some of these policies are impacting things, but the discussion seems to not capture those kinds of things. So this is sort of my argument that we need not just data, but we need to have an analytic framework, one that's removed from politics to some extent, and that's a very difficult thing to do. What this basically shows is the top 10 H-1B employers, and if you talk to employers like Microsoft, who was testifying at that Senate hearing that they need more H-1Bs, in fact, they're number 4 in terms of rank of the number of H-1Bs they've got, but you've got Infosys and Wipro and Satyam. This is basically a who's who of the Indian IT sector are the top recipients of these H-1B visas. The reason is what? They can legally pay below market wages. They have the visas tied to the employer, not controlled by the worker. And so not only are American workers now competing, in my case, against my cousins in Bangalore, they're importing the folks from Bangalore to compete head-to-head and taking away some of the comparative advantage that I have and others have of the geographic proximity to the customers in the U.S. The question is, what do we do about this? Now, this has been known for a number of years, but there's really been no action on it. And again, this goes to people aren't funding this kind of research. There's not that kind of public discussion that gets out there. And this translates into jobs. So offshoring is creating jobs, just not for Americans. You can look at Infosys, and Cognizant, which is based in the U.S., how many jobs they created over the last 4 years. Infosys grew by 59,000, Cognizant by 99,000. Our great companies, tech companies, Google and Microsoft over that period paled in comparison in terms of the total number of jobs they created. And Infosys and Cognizant's employment numbers, they, again, hire almost no Americans. So what you're looking at is basically low-cost overseas talent. So these policies and these trends translate into jobs, and I think we need to be thinking about competitiveness in terms of jobs and workforce competitiveness so that companies like Infosys, when they're growing, more power to them, that they're actually hiring American workers along the way and that it's creating jobs and prosperity for all of us. So let me leave it at that.
Very good. Questions, please? Nick Von Ortos, George Washington University. This is exactly what I think is the type of discussion we should have here, because it tries to get into some explanation of what we are noticing. Let me offer one out-of-the-box explanation, perhaps, in these trends. There is a big literature out there that deals with a knowledge-based economy and all that. And in that literature, a basic idea is what kinds of knowledge we have available and what kinds of knowledge different workers handle. Now, the types of knowledge that are available there are four: know what, know why, know how, know who. The first two is knowledge that you can find written in books and in the internet and all that. The last two is experiential knowledge, tacit knowledge. Now, I want to put on the table that the types of jobs that are tradable are primarily heavy on the first two types of knowledge, and this is all science. And I want to put also on the table that the types of jobs that we are not losing, and they are sticky, are the kinds of jobs that have tacit information, knowledge. And I want to go one more step beyond and say, if we want to maintain the first types of jobs, the science jobs that we are losing, here we have to infuse them with the other type of knowledge, which is tacit information. In other words, make engineers better educated in management.
Yeah, I should say that if you want to make some comments, please, on past discussions here, please see Marge and Bernadette at the front desk, and you can put your comments into our website, and we encourage you to do so. So I guess that's the end of the questions. Do you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to just respond, and we could talk over the break too. You know, IT services is kind of an interesting area because I think it requires a lot of experiential knowledge. You learn by doing, and there's a lot of knowledge that's gained as you work project to project to project. And you develop specializations within verticals and things like that. And that's been offshored quite significantly. Now, some of that work is geographically sticky. It's the interface with the customer and those kinds of things. The problem we have with policy is that those jobs that are sticky are actually not even going to Americans. They're importing the cheaper foreign workers. So I'm not, and we could have a greater discussion on this, I'm not convinced that tacit knowledge in and of itself is what makes things sticky. But again, we should be measuring the kinds of things that are sticky and the kinds of things that are not, and what are the characteristics of those types of work and tasks, and we should be investing in those, as Blinder argues, right?
Okay, one last question over here.
David Payton with the Vermeer Corporation. You have a whole lot of data about IT services in India. There's no language question, everyone's speaking English. Mm-hmm. What about situations where a company's looking for someone with a lot of technical skills but is bilingual in English and Chinese? How many U.S. citizens would fill the bill there, or is the company more or less stuck with hiring a Chinese national? Well,
I think this is a really interesting question, and I've been working with some engineering educators, right? So what's going on in engineering education right now, one of the arguments is that we need to have our students go and study abroad, learn other languages, those kinds of things, betting that will make them better able to work with these global teams, right? Because the nature of the work has gone where they've got cross-border teams, and how do you do that, the cultural issues and those types of things. And a number of universities are investing in that kind of thing. When I talk to my career services folks, and they're really good because we are a co-op school, so they have a very good tie to the employers, they're quite skeptical that actually is a value-added skill. And so is that a good investment? Study abroad for our technical workers to make them more competitive. Will employers really pay a premium for that kind of thing? And it's not clear to me that, again, we have the data on that kind of thing.